Okay, Boker Tov. So we begin the second daf of Yevamot, which of course is why we're daf Gimel today. Um, and thank you to Michael for getting us started. I know Michael gave a whole introduction. I'll just say then a few brief words. Maybe some of it, I'm sure a good amount will be repetitive, but just to say my own very brief introduction. First of all, we're beginning Seder Noshim. Seder Noshim is generally translated, of course, as women. But a very reasonable suggestion has been made that it might be the proper translation is actually wives, right? Because Isha, so like you say, like, Shlomo had many nashim, it doesn't mean women, it means wives, right? So actually the same plural would apply. And so much of the tractates are about issues relating to wives, Yevamot, Kitin, Kiddushin, even the Darim, so much of that in the Torah, although it's also about young daughters underage, but it's about the husband or the father annulling. So that's interesting to think about in general, in terms of, how women, what their general sort of assumed role and being treated as a subject matter would be. It's also a very challenging and difficult Masechet to begin the Seder with. It's not great for the Daf Yomi. The Siddharim are ordered by the largest Masechtas first. So you first get like Shabbos and Eruvin, these huge Masechtos judged by number of prakim. For Daf Yomi purposes, it would have been good if it would have been reverse order. So get people in low and then build them up to it. So we are starting with a very big Masechet, which is going to last us for many months. I think we'll end around President's Day. While, of course, a good part of it deals with the actual mitzvah of Yibum, it should be mentioned that an equal important section of it deals with general issues relating about personal status, and therefore questions about mamzer, about who can marry in and not, psuadaka, krus shifcha, questions about people who you're not sure, what their Jewish status is, or you're not sure about whether, who their parents, who their father is, and so on. Issues about people that women that Kohanim cannot marry. So basically, an enormous amount, even Gerus, enormous is in here. So basically, pretty much everything you'd expect relating to issues of personal status are found in Yevamot. Also, issues about Aguna, even though you would expect to find that in Gittin, but a question if a husband's woman has died or not, and trusting a single witness to testify about that. So it's worth sort of approaching it that way rather than approaching it like, oh, we're going to have digressions. It'll be about Yevamos with a lot of digressions. Really, this is the Masechet that deals with issues around personal status after the mitzvah of Yibum. Also, we should just say that literal meaning of the word Yabam or Yevamah is brother-in-law and sister-in-law. So although the mitzvah of Yibum is translated as levirate marriage, I don't even know why, but where the word levirate comes from, it has nothing to do with Levi, Levi. But anyway, it doesn't only mean, the person to whom you do Yibum to, or the person who does Yibum. It's not only sort of the technical term relating to the mitzvah. A Yevamah is a sister-in-law, and a Yavam is a brother-in-law, but obviously it also has a technical sense as well. And as I know that Michael discussed with you, we definitely find Yibum before Matan Torah by Yehud and Tamar. We also find it by Ruth, where it's not clear that that's Yibum. It sounds like a lot of things around there sound like Yibum, but we're not dealing with brothers. That leads Ramban to say that Yibum existed, in ancient cultures pre-Matan Torah, and it even existed not with the brother, but existed with any relative, or any, I guess, male relative, obviously, and sort of seeing echoes in that in the root story, and then saying, but the Torah came, and because of the prohibition of arayot, forbade it in general, but did allow it to remain in the one case by the issue of brothers. And it does raise a whole interesting point about what does it mean? Why is it so important? What does it mean? Lahakim shem achiv hameis. It certainly does not mean that the child born from the union should be given just literally the name. Like, what name do you give the kid? After the father, we don't find that at all in the Torah. We don't find that in the story of Yehud and Tamar. That was to name the child, right? That's a good point too. Why does it require the act of Yibum? And it does seem more that there is something metaphysical going on. The Ramban hints to the idea of Gilgul Nishamot, of some type of a reincarnation of the dead brother's soul that somehow may be made possible when when the conception comes through a family member, somehow that, I don't know, allows for some type of this reincarnation, even if you don't believe in the sort of reincarnation. But there clearly seems to be something deeper at a metaphysical level, that when this happens through a family member, somehow the child is more a real continuity of the dead father. And for halachic purposes, what it means has a lot to do with issues of inheritance and who inherits the dead father's property. But we will see that that's not necessarily unanimous or a consensus. And the last thing that I'll say about that, which is fascinating, is because of the challenge, and so much of what we'll be dealing with, is the idea that the mitzvah yibum overrides the biblical prohibition of a dead brother or sister. So if the brother died and then there were children, or other reasons why the woman is pater in yibum, like the whole issue of sarot that we were seeing in the opening Mishnah, of erva and sarot erva, that then there's an isur kares for one brother to marry his brother. I said dead brother, I meant dead brother's wife, for him to marry his dead brother's wife. And that's an isur karet. But to deal with that, the non-rabbinic Jews, Karaites, and the what do you call it? I think that was it Sdukim or the Essenes. I think it's the Essenes. Anyway, it had different interpretations. So the Karaites said that, fascinating idea. They said that the Torah actually only allows yibum in a case when it's not the brother. That when it says achim, it means achim loosely, like Avram says Tolot, anashim achim anachnu, and it doesn't mean brother. And the only time the mitzvah of yibum would apply would be in a case like Ruth, where you're related, but you're not a forbidden arayot relationship. And that's how they sort of deal with that problem of it running up against the Isur Arayot. I think at the Essenes or somebody else wanted to claim that Yibum was only by Eresin, not Nisu, and other ways of dealing with the problem, that it's going against an Isur Arayot of brother's wife. Of course, for Chazal, that is the whole Chiddush of Yibum, and that's actually what we're going to get to today, whether it fits in a normal pattern of Esei Dochelot Hasei, or is it a great, much more of a radical Chidush. One of the times where the Torah says, two things were said b'dibur echad, so sometimes it's like more of a zachor, which are not contradictory. They're two aspects of Shabbos, but it's dealing with the difference of the Aseret HaDibrot. But more interestingly is when it speaks about two things which are basically contradictory. So, and one of the best cases that the Gemara has of Nemru b'dibur echad, in the sense that yes, they're contradictory and they're both true, is the Isser of Eshesach and Yevamot Yavo Aleha. So clearly that is one of the fascinating aspects of Yibum, is how it runs up against that Isra Arayot. And that's what I have to say for the introduction. Charlie.
Levir is Latin for husband's brother.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Okay. Yes.
How do we know that the Isur outlives the relationship? So, in other words, if your brother were to divorce his wife,
right.
How do you know that?
Right, so that's a good question, and we will be seeing that, because one of the things I should have said, in addition to status issues, one of the major things that Yevamot deals with is Isur Arayos, and halachically defining the act of sex, which comes from Sukkim about Yibum, and B, general issues around Isur Arayot. And we are going to see, for example, that wife's sister is learned to not continue after her death, because it says Bechayeha. But in general, these Isurim are, the default assumption should be that it continues even after the relationship severs, unless you sort of explicitly know otherwise, like the case of the wife's sister. But we will see that. But yes.
I was thinking, which is interesting. You're saying if it's an idea, let's say, Gilgul Nishamot. So let's say the guy who died was a really bad guy. Do you really want to, bring?
That's an interesting question. Whether, does the about things about the relationship, about character and tzaddik in Russia, as opposed to. Yeah, okay, that's a fascinating question. I don't know. Basically, I've shared with you now about 50% of everything I know about Gilgul Nishamot. So, all right. So anyway, all right. So now, so we will continue now on Daf Gimel. Michael, where did you leave us off? Very first word, Kulu. Okay. So what we are finding now at the beginning of this Masechet is what we find at the beginning of many Masechtot, which is a opening stam piece, which is very technical and very. But not like conceptual, I should say, very much also about language and like gets itself, in a high, very hyper concerned about a technical, the grammar or language issue around the Mishnah. So people know, for example, Kiddushin opens with why does it say Ha'isha niknes and not Ha'ish koneh, and why does it use, this language of Kinyan and not that language of Kinyan, and it asks all these sort of questions about the phrasing, or larbasa, what does or mean, the phrasing of the Mishnah. Generally understood that this is one of the latest layers of the Gemara, maybe even added after the general stam editing of the Gemara. This is based on a letter of Rav Shri Ragon, who points out that this often opens Masechtot, and nothing new is actually said in these sections. It will sometimes use it as an opportunity to quote material that is coming up later, or to allude to ideas or introduce ideas that will be relevant in the future discussions, but it doesn't develop any new ideas itself, and that's what we're in the middle of. That'll be half of today's daf, and then the other half will actually turn to the core issue about this idea of erva and saras erva. But right now we're dealing with the question about what was the order of the Mishnah. Why did the Mishnah start when it talks about the arayot that might be married to a man's brother, and therefore he can't do yibum with her or with the co-wives, the tsarot, who those arayot are? It starts with his daughter, and then granddaughter, and then it goes to his wife's daughter, and his wife's granddaughter, his father-in-law, his mother-in-law, his grandmother-in-law, etc. So what is that order about? So the first thing the Gemara says is that maybe it's because let's actually read from the bottom of Yevamot Bet. So the Gemara says like this. Ella Bito, last line on Yevamot Bet. The reason it starts with daughter is kivan the asimi drasha chavivale, because it's learned out from a drasha. It's not explicit in the verse. It's dear to the Tana. Sometimes an idea that the Tanaim are more interested in quoting stuff that's part of their, of stuff that they have sort of uncovered or revealed or interpreted, rather than things that are explicit in the verse. Now, what do you mean that the daughter is not explicit? I mean, the Torah constantly says, don't marry, don't marry a woman and her mother, a woman and her daughter, and so on. So the point is that every time the Torah speaks about marrying a woman and her daughter, it speaks about your wife's daughter. So, for example, if you take a look, Rashi quotes the pasuk. It says, "Ervas isha ubita lo tegaleh, espas bina vespas bita lo tikach legalot ervata." Okay, so ervat isha ubita lo tegaleh. Okay, and then it says espas bita vespas bina, espas bita vespas bina. So there you get daughter and granddaughters. Okay, but again, my point about whether nashi means women or wives, you would have interpreted this, I think, most naturally as a woman and her daughter. Okay, but the rabbis interpret it to be your wife and her daughter. So man cannot be married to or have sex with his wife's daughter. But what about his biological daughter that is not his wife's daughter, born to a woman that he did not marry? Okay, where do we know that is forbidden on somebody? So the issue of bito, not bas ishto, right? There could be bas ishto who's also bito, but somebody who's just bito, just his daughter and not his wife's daughter. So it's his daughter from a non-marital union. Where do we know that's usher? That's never in the Torah. And therefore, we only learn it out from a drasha, and that's why it says milsa de isa b'drasha, something that was learned from a drasha, chavivale. Now, we actually came across this in Chagiga, and I do have to tell you that disturbingly, the way the Gemara refers to a biological daughter that is not a wife's daughter is bito ne anusato. And I really do not know why the Gemara gives the example of born from rape. Why didn't it say bito mi mifutasa, from the woman that he seduced? If you wanted to use a biblical, you don't want to say extramarital, whatever. There's not a biblical category like that, but there is a biblical category of mifuta, a woman that is seduced, rather than a woman that's raped.
And it's pelagic.
Well, yeah, true. But within the sort of arayos discussions, you have these categories. So it is disturbing that it uses that example, but that's biological daughter, and that's not explicitly in the psukim. So therefore, the Gemara says the Tana would like to open with that. Okay, so let's take a look. So it says like this: Kulu nami midrasha asu. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. All of the cases in the Mishnah, the idea that there's a exemption of yibum when you're dealing with an erva is not explicit in the psukim. It's learned out from a drasha, which we'll get to. So all the 15 women that are arayot are their exempt status of yibum is learned from a drasha. Why is Bito being privileged here, being listed first? So the Gemara says, no, nihidilin yibum asyan midrasha. It's true relating to yibum aspects, the exemption from yibum. All these arayot are learned out from a drasha, but ikar isurayu behed yiksiv. The basic fact that it is an arayos, that's explicit in the psukim. Bita, but a man's biological daughter who is not his wife's daughter, ikar isura midrasha. The fundamental prohibition comes, we only learn out from a drasha, from a rabbinic interpretation, not an explicit verse. The Amar Rava, because Rava says, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Dimi, Asya heina heina, Asya zima zima. We make a gzeira shava from the words heina heina and zima zima. So what's the gzeira shava? So here it says by, meaning the funny thing is that it says that a man cannot have sex with his granddaughter, okay, and biological granddaughter, even not his wife's child, not descendant from his wife. So the Gemara says, well, if you can't have sex with your granddaughter, kavachomer with your daughter, but you can't get punished or warned from a kavachomer, you need an explicit verse. Okay, so number one, even though you do have a verse for granddaughter, but there is a gzeira shava to tell you that it's forbidden. What's the gzeira shava? So so where's Rashi say? It says, okay, Rashi doesn't quote the whole gzeira. Wait, does he? 1 minute? Yeah, 1 minute. A minute. Okay, so it says by the case of biological granddaughter, it says as bas bina. No, it says what? What's the pasuk? Ervat, thank you. Ervat bat bincha o bat bitecha. So notice again, it's granddaughter, but it mentions no wife, so it's biological, right? Lo sikach legalo servasa. Ki ervatcha hena. Okay, ki ervatcha hena. Okay, so that's that word of hena. Okay, and so that's the hena. And there's another pasuk that says she'ira hena zimahi. Okay, which is what's that pasuk? What's the whole pasuk there? Okay, thank you. Isha uvita lo tegale she'ira hena.
It's bat bina, it's bat bita.
Bat bina, right? I know bat bita, right? She'ira hena.
Shara hena zimahi.
Okay, so what we say is like this. So here, because you have Hena here by biological granddaughter, and you have Hena here by wife's, sort of granddaughter and granddaughter. So we say that the same way here, daughter is prohibited, just like granddaughter. So here, if granddaughter is prohibited, daughter is also prohibited. So we know that daughter is prohibited based on the hena linking biological granddaughter to wife's granddaughter. Okay, so that gets us. So the hena gets us the idea that the daughter is also prohibited. People get that now. The zima tells you that it's punished by that it's equally punished punished by sreifa, by burning, by execution of the court, because it says here sharahina zimahi. And it says by another pasuk, Rashi quotes, hold on, Be'esh yisrifu, 1 minute, Zimai, Be'esh yisrifu osoves hain, right? What is it? I think that's by Isho Ubita, right? Zima. Okay, so by wife's daughter and granddaughter, it says Be'esh yisrifu oto eten. What? V'lo tihya zima b'tochachem.
2014.
So again, by wife, you have the idea of not only granddaughter by daughter, and by wife you have the idea of sreifa, punishable by death. So the hena gets us to learn from the wife example that biological includes daughter, and sort of through a daisy chaining, because it doesn't say zima up here, but through a daisy chaining, once it's linked to this word of hena, that links there, and then the hena is linked to zima, and zima gets you down here, right? You sort of see how you get that, right? So then if we're going to learn the prohibition of daughter, we're also going to learn that it's all from sreifa, okay? So you have a pasuk of biological where it only mentions granddaughter and it doesn't mention the punishment. By wife, it mentions daughter and granddaughter, and it mentions the punishment. So the Hena gets us to the daughter, and the Hena through the Zima gets us to the Sreifa. Okay?
So that's acceptable to derive a
Yeah,
like that.
it's only by kachim you're not allowed to do that. Okay, by other things you are. Okay, anyway, so that's how we learn daughter from a pasuk, and that's why we wanted to start with it. So now the Gemara says like this. One minute. If the Tana prefers, it's dear to him, things that are learned out from a drasha, so lisni la'achos isha lebesof. So then the one thing that is not learned out from a drasha is the case of achos ishto, because as we're going to find out, the wife's sister, the idea that an erva is exempt from yibum, starts from a pasuk by wife's sister. That's what we're going to see when we turn the page. Okay, so it's saying like this. It's saying you started with bito. Let's talk about what the list of the Mishnah is. Okay, the Mishnah first has bito, and then all of the things related to bito, right? Bas, bito, etc. Then it has bas ishto, right? And bas bita, etc. Right? So you have bas bita, You have bito number one, then bas ishto. Then what's the next series?
You have the chamoto.
Okay, so you have chamoto. Okay, so notice these are all one generation, either down or up, right? And aim, chamoto, etc. And then and then just continuing the list. Okay, so you have daughter, and essentially a mother or mother-in-law. Yes, and then what?
You have achoto me'imo.
Okay, then you have achoto. Okay,
And
you have sisters.
Achot this, achot that.
Right, achot this, achot that, and then one generation up as well. So the sister idea, yes. And then you have three Eshets, and then three things through Y. Eshet achiv me'imo. What was the other Eshet?
Well, you also have Eshet achiv shelo haya ba'olamo and
Achiv
chalato.
shelo haya ba'olamo.
And then you have chalato.
Ba'olamo and chalato is what?
The last one.
Yeah, I know, but what is it? It's essentially Eshes beno. Okay, Eshes beno, which is called chalato. Okay, so you have three cases of Y's. Okay, so do you see how it's organized?
Mm-hmm.
Daughter, mother, sister, wife. Is that clear to people how that's organized? Okay, so what it's saying is, so you want to start with daughter because the whole prohibition of daughter is learned out from a drasha. But basically, we're prioritizing things learned out from a drasha. Fine, but it says, so everything else is explicit in the pasuk. That's the only arise learned out from a drasha. But everything else, the fact that an erva is exempt from yibum is also a drasha. The one thing that's not a drasha, I mean, it is a drasha, but it's okay, not as much of a drasha, is wife's sister. That thing, that she is an erva and exempt from yibum, the Gemara feels is more explicit in the pasuk. So if the general rule is prioritizing the drashas, the very last thing that should have been mentioned should have been wife's sister, which is, where is it? Achos Isha. Where's Achos Isha?
You have achot, the third thing, right?
Achos Isha. One of them is Achos Isha, right? In the Achos list?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, so why, if we're prioritizing drashas and more explicit is at the end, Achos Ishta, which is explicit not only that she's forbidden, but that she exempts Yibum, should be the last thing listed. Why is she not the last thing listed? If that really is the organizing principle. So let's take a look. So it says like this. Lisni la'achos Ishta lebesof. But says no. Since we started talking about sort of siblings, Tana achos ishto, right? Then we talked about, so it says basic point. After we got through the daughters and the mothers, the next thing to go is sisters. And we mentioned wife, sisters, so no longer, now we have a different type of an organization. It's not, we began here because this was a drasha, but after that it follows more of a logical organization. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. The lisni lahai bava libesof, but the Gemara says, okay, so what, you're going to include achos isha when you get to the sister sort of section. But again, if drashas are dominating and drashas come first, why don't you have the whole sister section come at the bottom? Why don't you have the sister section come after the wife section? If the point is to have drashas before non-drashas. So the Gemara says, Ella, fine. Let's forget this whole idea of drashas. It's not about drashas. There's a better organization here. And this is clearly the pshat. Tana, korve naket. It's listing it in order of degree of relation. Tana bito, ubas bito, ubas beno, to korve atzmo. First, you deal with your own children, daughter, granddaughter, etc. Those are the people most closely related to you. The idea to Tana shlosha dars lamata dide, Tanami shlosha dars lamata dida. So once you deal with your children and grandchildren, then you deal with your wife's children and grandchildren. If you say which is the closest relation to you want to start with. So daughter, you'd say more than sister, right? The only one perhaps more than that is mother. It's interesting that mother isn't up here. I could talk about that in a minute. But you got daughter, then you might, well, as long as we're talking about daughters, talk about wife's daughters. And as long as we're talking about going down generations, talk about going up generations. So talk about wives, mother and grandmother.
Well, would you go lateral, down, lateral?
Same direction. Okay. The ID Ditani Sholosh Dars Lamata Dida. So, and once you gave 3 generations down on her side, so Tana Sholosh Dars Lamala Dida, you do 3 generations up on her side, mother and grandmother. Then once we did going down and going up, the Tana Chosa, then would go sideways, sister. Achos imo, dekrove atzmo. Then you do with sisters and people that are mother's sister, wife's sister. You do all the sisters. The ivy biser achva tani achos ishto. And once we're dealing with relatives like who are sisters, like achos imo, right? Because achos imo is more the relative. Achoso and then achos imo and then achos ishto. Because achos ishto is not isn't a blood relation. But this is all the relatives. So we did vertical. So we did that, and then we did that, and now we're doing this way. We're doing horizontal. And once we're doing horizontal blood relatives, we also do achos ishto. Okay, 1 minute. Okay, so tani achos ishto. B'dinu deliktime lekalaso mikmi esha sachiv shelo haya ba'olamo. Delo mishum korvahu da'asira. Now, it really should have had your son's wife before Eishes Achli Shelo Haya B'Olamo. Once we did sisters, now into wives. Okay, so Kaloso actually should have been first. Why? Because Kaloso, it says, is because this is not really Eishes Achli Shelo Haya B'Olamo is really not so much an isser of Korva. It doesn't start with the concept of arayos as much as it starts with the concept of there was no mitzvah yibum. Right? Did Michael explain to you what Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo means? Is that somebody, Shimon died, and Reuven did chalitza to Shimon's wife, and then Levi was born. Okay, so Shimon's wife is now a woman that he never had a mitzvah yibum towards. Right? Right? Is that clear? Reuven, Shimon. Okay, so Shimon is married to this woman. Okay, Shimon dies. Okay, Reuven goes ahead and does yibum to her. Then, after he does yibum, okay, so step 1, step 2, and then step 3. Then Levi is born. Okay, so now, and Reuven might be married to another wife as well. Wife number 2. Okay, so now Reuven dies. So Levi, he doesn't have a mitzvah yibum on wife number 2 because it's usher to do yibum on wife number 1. Why is he usher to do mitzvah on wife number 1? Brother's wife, big deal. That's a mitzvah of yibum because it was also a brother's wife that he didn't have a mitzvah of yibum with. It was Shimon's wife, and he didn't have a mitzvah of yibum on Shimon's wife because he wasn't born yet. Okay, so that's considered achos isha shelo haya ba'olamo. He was never in the world. So that is not really based on that. Fundamentally, it's an erva. It's based on the idea that there was no mitzvah yibum. Okay, so it really should have said kalaso before it said achos Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo. The lo mishum korva hu da'asira, that cat is not because of korva that it's forbidden. Ella Aidi da'Avi Biser Achva Tana Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo. But since we were dealing with sisters, so then when we're going to deal with wives, we're going to deal with wives of sisters. So Eishes Achiv Me'imo and Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo. So the sister idea, the sibling idea affected that the first wives that we would mention would be wives of siblings, and then we would get to wife of son. Okay, the Hadrantani Kalaso, and then it said daughter-in-law, and that actually is good pshat. That exactly makes sense what the organization is, right? You do vertical, then do horizontal, then it leads to this and that or whatever, and that's fine. That's the organization. Okay. So now the Gemara says like this. Now we're done with the order. Now we get to another linguistic issue, which is the language of exempt. Why does it say they're exempt? Why doesn't it say that they are forbidden to do yibum, because then it becomes, once you're exempt, you become forbidden. Then it becomes eishes achiv. So let's take a look. So it says like this. Why does it say that they exempt their tzarot? Lisni osrot, that the tzarot are forbidden to have yibum done to them. No, itana osrot, they forbid. Havamina asr liyabein. You don't. It's forbidden to do yibum because that would be a type of arayas, etc. Aval michlas chalza. Maybe you should do chalitza. Because this is always an issue. You have to be really serious when you say you're patur from yibum and chalitza. That means there's no obligation, right? If you wanted to come up with a rabbinic stringency, you would say don't do yibum, but there's still a biblical obligation. You got to get out of that. You got to do chalitza. And we do have some categories that are like that because of suffix or other rabbinic issues where we say don't do yibum but do chalitza. So if you just had said usher, you might have said usher to do yibum, but maybe that's a rabbinic, maybe there's still a biblical issue going on, maybe you still have to do chalitza. So therefore, not to make that confusion, we said exempt. Exempt means across the board. Okay, you would have to do chalitza. Kamash malan. So the Gemara says that's not an answer. The listening asura lachlot. Be explicit. It's asur to do chalitza, which means that you don't do anything chalitza or yibum. The Gemara says, what do you mean it's asur to do chalitza? My kavid. What do you mean? Why should it be asur to do chalitza? Yibum is asur because it's an act of sex and it's arayas and it's chayiv kares if it's not a mitzvah of yibum. But how could it be asur to do chalitza? What is there? Is you're about to taking off a shoe and spitting? So the Gemara says, no, don't get around. Alama, how could it not be asur? We won't allow somebody to do a chalitza. Oh, what big deal? I'm just spitting. I'm just taking off a shoe. No, because you're sending a message that you think that the mitzvah of yibum applies. That's the implicit message you send when you do chalitza. And the next guy who comes along is going to do yibum in this case. So we won't let you do chalitza. So why did the Mishnah say exempt? Just say asur lachlot. And I could have figured everything else out. Okay? So the Gemara says no. No. Even the b'makom mitzvah hu da asura tzara v'shelo b'makom mitzvah sharia mishum hachitana potrot. So we're going to find out in a later Mishnah that, let's say that this idea of tzara, how does the idea of tzara, of erva affecting tzara work? Okay, just conceptually, what it's saying is I don't have a mitzvah to do yibum to this woman who's my daughter, sister, whatever, and therefore it doesn't create an isser arayas on the other woman. It says there's no mitzvah yibum on the other woman, and since there's no mitzvah yibum, then automatically she becomes forbidden as my brother's wife. So conceptually, the way it works is it removes the mitzvah of yibum. How would it be different if I would have communicated the idea as she makes her co-wife forbidden? I did not frame it in terms of yibum. I just said she makes her co-wife forbidden. Well, then I would have said, let's take another scenario. Let's say my daughter is married to a man who I'm not related to. Okay, married to, I don't know, Esav. That's actually interesting. Rashi says Nochri, but Rashi doesn't mean Nochri, a non-Jew. He means a non-relative. Okay, so let's say my wife is married to somebody I'm not related to, my daughter, and he's also married to another woman, and this guy dies. No, but whatever, just a stranger she's married to. Okay, so if I would have said, oh, my daughter makes a co-wife forbidden to me, then I would have said, I can't marry this stranger's co-wife because he was also married to my daughter, and my daughter makes the co-wife forbidden. So you can't say the arayas makes the other woman forbidden. That's not the mechanism. The mechanism is she removes the mitzvah of yibum, and since she removes the mitzvah of yibum, then automatically the other woman is forbidden as my brother's wife. But if they were married to a stranger, then I would be able to marry the other woman, right? So that's what it's saying. If you would have, and that's really a really good answer. It had to say potros because that's exactly the mechanism. The mechanism of how things are working is that the mitzvah of yibum no longer applies. It's not a mechanism that an arayos makes a co-wife forbidden to the man. Okay, so that's what it says. It says, "Kivan de b'makom mitzvahu da asira tzara." The tzara, the co-wife, becomes forbidden in a context of mitzvah, meaning in a case of brother's wife. Shelo b'makom mitzvah. If it's not a context of mitzvah, it's not a brother's wife. Sharia, then a tzara to an erva is still permitted to a man if they're not married to his brother. So therefore it says you exempt from mitzvah of yibum. That's the mechanism, not a mechanism of making the other woman forbidden. So the Gemara says, fine. So now we've solved that. We've solved the order, right? We're going through the whole thing. Chamesh Esrei Nashim Potros Hein V'Tzarasein da 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 da. So we got the order. We got the word potrot. The last linguistic issue we're going to ask is, why does it say min ha? What does it say? Min ha chalitza, min ha yibum, and not min ha yibum, min ha chalitza, right? If you were learning this Masechet with a chavruta and he started asking these questions, right, you would probably say, could you please just focus on the real issues and not ask these types of questions? But the Gemara is, like I said, this opening sugya gets its, focuses on these types of linguistic issues. So let's take a look. So it says like this. Why does it say mina chalitza mina yibum? Listening mina yibum l'chudei. Just say you're exempt from yibum, since yibum is the mitzvah. The prime mitzvah is yibum, and everything else follows that. No, so it says like this. No. Itana mina yibum. If it just said you're exempt from yibum, hava mina michlas chalza. Yevume lo miyabma. Going back to the point, I might have thought, fine, you don't do yibum, but still do chalitza. Play it safe. Maybe there's still a biblical issue that needs to be addressed. Maybe it's only a rabbinic reason you don't do yibum. So there's always this possibility that there are some women that you don't do yibum for, but you do chalitza for because suffix or other issues. So therefore, you could not just say pater min hayibum. Okay, do chalitza, don't do yibum. Kamash Milan, that no. Anybody obligated in yibum is chalitza applies to. If there's no obligation of yibum, chalitza, there's no chalitza. Now, it does not mean that there won't be women that you do chalitza, not yibum. That could be because suffix. So if there's a suffix, whether you're able to do yibum, you're not allowed to do it, but you have to do chalitza. Or if there's a rabbinic reason why you don't do yibum. But at a biblical level, if you don't do one, you don't do the other. They go together. And therefore, package deal. And therefore, we didn't want you to misunderstand that, so we made it clear that exempt from both. So the Gemara says, fine, you got to say both, but why was your order chalitza first? The order should have been yibum first. Yibum is the more important one. The lisni mina yibum umina chalitza, or inami mina chalitza l'chudei. Just say exempt from chalitza. Why say chalitza and yibum? Do both of them and do it in that order. So the Gemara says, Abba Shol, it's going like Abba Shol. The Amar, mitzvahs chalitza kodemes l'mitzvahs yibum, that actually, that we encourage people to do chalitza before yibum. I mean, people might know, if you've ever heard about these cases, right, in Ashkenazi communities, that's completely correct. That, people basically, even if the surviving brother is not married, basically told you're supposed to do chalitza. In Sephardi communities, at least in some of them, they actually say, no, what are you talking about? The basic mitzvah is a mitzvah of yibum, and therefore, especially, it's also more possible to have that approach if you have if you don't have a culture and of monogamy. So polygamy is a possibility. You can also have a general approach about saying that we prioritize yibum. Now, why to not prioritize yibum is quite fascinating. And if you take a look at Rashi at the bottom, he quotes, we'll see more of this in the Gemara, but 2 lines from the bottom, Rashi says, Abashol he beperka cholet. Abashol omer hakonis yivimto l'shum noy l'shum ishus ki'ilu pogeh be'erva. Because you might actually want to do yibum because you actually are attracted to this woman, or maybe you actually really do want to marry this woman. You'd want to marry her if she wasn't your brother's wife. Now we would think, what's wrong with that? If you're already doing yibum, hopefully there could develop some relationship here. No, then it's no longer l'shem mitzvah. Then it's more of normal type of it's a normal type of an attraction and a in a marriage that's not about the mitzvah. Then it's more. So then you don't have the legitimacy of the mitzvah framing why you're doing it. The karov be'enai liyosef lad mamzer. It's practically like an iser eshasach if you're not doing it in the framework and the mentality of doing it all l'shem shamayim. Okay, so that's pretty heavy, right? Because we would say, like, if you got to do it, you might as well, the better place to do it is when actually maybe they're interested in getting married to one another. So that's his approach. So the Gemara says, following that approach, we mentioned chalitza first to underscore that chalitza is the preferred mode. Okay, now, fine. Now we're done with the order. We're done with the phrase of potrot, and we're done with why it says chalitza before yibum. Well, yeah, but then it wouldn't have emphasized it comes first, and it would have just been felt to have picked one arbitrarily. If you say both and you put it first, it makes more of the point. Okay, so now the Gemara says, we're still not done. Why did it have to say 15? I know how to count. And why did it have to say at the end, these women are patur? It seems like it's trying to give you an exact list. What's it trying to exclude by this list? So the Gemara says, to exclude Rav and Rav Asi. Rav and Rav Asi wanted to add to this list. How do they want to add to this list other women who are exempt? So Rav had a case about a tsara sota. A man's wife basically has committed adultery or suspected of committed adultery, but let's even make it easier, committed adultery. So he's no longer allowed to have sex with his wife. Okay, now, then let's forget Sarah a minute. Then the man dies. Does the brother have to do Yibum? Well, this is a principle of the brother is only doing Yibum because the dead brother, if he were alive, would have the possibility of having sex with his wife and having a child. This man who himself could not have had sex with his wife, so the brother isn't obligated to take the place. That was not a union that was actually a viable union in terms of conceiving a child, having sex and conceiving a child. So in that case, he's exempt from Yibum. Let's say this woman who had committed adultery, she has a co-wife. Well, if you're exempt from doing Yibum to one woman, you're exempt from doing Yibum to the other woman. So that's the case about Tsaras Sota. That's Rav's case. What's Rav Asi's case? So Rav says that Tsara is exempt from Yibum. By our Mishnah, right, thank you. By our Mishnah listing only 15, it's not denying that you don't do Yibum to the woman who committed adultery, but you would do Yibum to the Tsara, because she's not really an erva, right? The idea here, all of these are arayot, right? The case about a man and his wife who's a sota, okay, whatever, that she's not an arayot to you. It's just the problem here is about their relationship, right? That's why there's no yibum, because that relationship is a broken relationship. Okay, so it's not an Erev idea. So Rav says, nevertheless, Sarah is also exempt. Whereas, so what the Gemara is saying is, no, the Mishnah says only 15 to say in this case you don't do yibum with the woman who committed adultery, but you still do yibum with the Sarah because it doesn't exempt the Sarah. What?
Why is that different than Nimtz's island?
Right, because Nimtz's island is yeah, but no, Nimtz's island isn't an Isser. It's just not able to. Right, and then there's a whole question. There's even a Mekach To's question, but that's just not physically able to. There's a real Isser, so it becomes exactly. But yes, that's a good point. We will see all this when we get to 1 minute. What's Rav Asi? So Rav Asi's case is Saras illness. Oh, there you go, Dov. So Rav Asi actually says the case of now illness is different. So Rav says a sota, and Rav Asi says illness. Now illness is a woman that can't have children, okay. And again, the problem here is not that she's an arayot, but that there's a problem with the relationship, the initial marriage, the initial relationship, and its ability to conceive children. So there you go. So he might actually say that, he might not. We'll see that in the Gemara. Obviously, there's a difference here because here it's not physically possible. It's not just an isser. So both of them say that even when it's not an arayos, if there's no yibum with one of the women, even if because of their relationship to the first husband, that creates an isser of tsara as well. Whereas the Gemara is saying that our Mishnah would be rejecting that and saying that actually no, yibum would still apply to the tsara because this is not about a raya. Let's just read the answer, don't take the question. So the Gemara says to limute derav deravasi. So the Gemara says Rav Asi limute mai. So that's very nice, but Rav and Rav Asi would like to believe that their cases are not rejected by the Mishnah. So if they would like to believe that their cases that they're correct and that the principle of tsara does apply in their cases, why is our Mishnah saying only 15? So the Gemara says like this: So if Rav holds of Rav Asi and Rav Asi holds of Rav, they basically agree with one another. Then chadam limutei tsaras mima enes, v'chadam limutei tsaras machzir grushaso. So there's two other cases that they would agree you don't have a principle of tsara. What would that be? One would be mim emes, and the other is machzir grusha. So let me just sort of read to the end, and then I'll explain it. And maybe if they don't hold of one another, Rav doesn't hold of Rav Asi, and Rav Asi doesn't hold of Rav. So chadali musei dechavre. So one of the, because it says 15 in the beginning, and it repeats, these are the ones. So it sounds like there are two things being rejected. So one thing being rejected is the one the other one holds of, right? Either the case of sota or ilinis. The chadali mute, and the other is to exclude itzaras memenes or tzaras machzir grushaso. Again, one of the other two, memenes or machzir grushaso. So what the Gemara says is, in addition to these two cases, which they say does have a tzara, and we could say the Mishnah is rejecting, but they wouldn't want them to say the Mishnah is rejecting their case. They would want to say, yes, the idea of tzara applies here. So we have two other cases that they agree that the principle of tzara does not apply. What are they? Mima enes and machzir grushaso. So what are these cases? So mima enes. Well, let me just double check Rashi about one thing. Okay, so basically, here's what you have. You have this man. Here's Reuven, and he's married to two women. He's married to Rachel and Leah. It just so happens that Rachel, as we know, was well, no, that's Rivka. Anyway, okay, so he's married to Rivka and Leah. So Rivka was very young. She was 3 years old. Okay, she's 3 years old. Actually, she's really just less than 12. Okay, so that it's only a rabbinic marriage. Okay, it's mamar. Michael spoke about that. If the father didn't marry her off, okay, if she was married off by the brothers or the mother, it's only a rabbinic marriage. And before Reuven died, she could have done miyun. She could have just said, "I don't want this marriage," and walked away. Verbally done miyun and walked away. Okay, so that's only rabbinic. Okay, now anyway, these there's no arayas here. Okay, there's no arayas, no nothing. It's just one of his wives is underage. He dies. Okay, now Shimon, can he go ahead and do yibum to Rivka? Well, that's a tricky thing because Rivka wasn't halachically really Reuven's wife. Okay, so we'll get to all of that. But because the idea is that the relationship that Reuven has sort of pseudo transfers to Shimon, that's called like Zika. Like Shimon now has a quasi, like an attachment, and sort of like a potential relationship, an attachment that can be fully made manifest through the act of yibum. It's like it's sort of seen as this partial thing that can become fully actualized through the act of yibum. It sort of transfers from Reuven to Shimon, the relationship. So the same way Rivka could do miyun to Reuven, Rivka could go ahead and do miyun to Shimon, and she's getting out of it. She did miyun, and she's walking away, and you can no longer do yibum to her. Okay, and we'll find out why it has to do with rabbinic, a whole sort of range of rabbinic. It has to do with rabbinic considerations. But that's the case of mima enet. So that whole thing is all like derabanan. The whole thing, her relationship to Reuven, her miyun to Shimon, everything is derabanan. So even though in this case, once she's done miyun and it breaks the relationship, Shimon can no longer do yibum to Rivka. He can still do yibum with Leah. Okay, so that would be the case of Tsaras Mima Enes. Hard enough to understand why he can't do it with Rivka, not a big chiddush that he can still do it with Leah. That's this case. Machzir Gushaso is easier. Okay, Reuven went ahead and he was married to Leah. Then he divorced her. Okay, and then he remarried her. Okay, so he was Machzir Gushaso. Okay, and then he's also got another wife, Rachel, that he never divorced. Okay, we should make this Yaakov. Okay, so we'll rewrite the biblical story. He divorced Leah and he remarried her, okay, and he wasn't allowed to if she was then with another man, but he always was married to Rachel, okay, and then Yaakov dies. So in this case, because he's not allowed to be married to Leah, okay, there's no yibum on Leah, but there would still be a case of Rachel. There still would be yibum. It would be different than the case of Sota because the Isser of Machzir Grushaso is of a different quality than the Isser of Sota. Let me just see if Rashi spells out. Meaning that there would not be a concept of tzara there.
It would not be a problem.
It would not be a problem, right? Okay. So I mean, we'll see why later. The Gemara doesn't explain it, but it's similar to the idea of Sota, where there's a prohibition of them to have sex. But here, the issue of Machzir Kushaso is more about him remarrying her than about the issue of sex, and therefore, whatever, it's of a different quality. Okay, and we will see, therefore, so in these cases, you would be able to do yibum with the tzara. So when the Mishnah is saying there are 15 that it affects the tzara as well, it's minimally excluding these two. These two could be cases where you don't do yibum with the wife, but you would still do yibum with the tzara. Yes.
So just one very quick question. I know our Mishnah just said I don't know stuff like that, but it would be the same idea if they're too old, 7 years old. Yibum wouldn't apply because no kids can come from that.
Right, probably. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's correct. Okay, so let's just get a little bit further. The Gemara says like this. So the Gemara says like this. So finally, okay, Lefi. 1 minute. Now the Gemara asks one final question about this. L'Rav Ravasi at least ninhu. So according to Rav and Ravasi, that there is a tzara idea here by Sota or by Ilinus. The tzara is also exempt. They have to explain why it's not in the Mishnah. If it's really true that these women, just as much as Arayot, exempt their tzara, then why are these two not listed in the Mishnah? It's a good question, right? So the Gemara says that is no lefish eno b'tzaras tzara. Because, okay, even if the Sota's co-wife would be exempt, if she went and she remarried and she married another brother, she would not exempt the next derivation, the tzara of the tzara. Okay, I'm not going to sort of explain
Mishnah
why
they all
right now.
do.
In the Mishnah, they all exempt the tzara and the tzara. So you see, we've totally confused you here. But what we've managed to do, like some of these opening sugyas do, is give you a window into some of the stuff that's coming up, some of the real complicated stuff. Like, oh my God, there's all these other possibilities of women you don't do yibum to, that maybe you still do it with the tzara, or maybe you do it with the tzara, but not with the tzara. You don't do it with the tzara, but you do it with the tzara, and so on. So we've introduced all these other categories, which we will get to later. Okay, I guess we will have to end here. So it's I already have gotten us behind. We'll have to pick up the page. But I'll say one thing before we end. I just want to point you to a Rashi on the Mishnah, which I just thought was fascinating, which I won't get another chance to point to. If you take a look at Rashi on the Mishnah, he says, fourth wide line, or the end of the third wide line from the top, from the very top, third line from the top, the Sarah saying at Sofa Olam, Rashi says, B'mas nisim mefarish. Like Rashi often says, the Gemara mefarish, right? What does this Mishnah mean? Oh, the Gemara will explain what the Mishnah means. Here Rashi's saying, the Mishnah later on will tell you what it means. And if you notice, the Mishnah was quite fascinating in its sort of almost self-reflective way, right? When the way the Mishnah said, oh, what do we mean by this? Here's what we mean. And it would spell out the scenario, right? You saw that in the Mishnah yesterday. So I thought it was very interesting. Rashi says, you know, if you don't want to understand this line of the Mishnah, wait till later down in the Mishnah, it'll become clear. Okay, so to be continued tomorrow.
I will not be here tomorrow. I'll listen to